Hi everyone, my name is Emily and I'm the director of the SBH Center for Culinary Medicine and Teaching Kitchen, and I'm bringing the Teaching Kitchen to you. And today I'm going to show you how to make a simple tomato soup. I love tomato soup because it's warm and comforting, and it's something that doesn't need a lot of ingredients and is something that many people can make with what's already in their pantry. So you can use canned tomato products for this soup, and if you have fresh tomatoes on hand, I can show you a fun way that we can incorporate them into our soup and get a lot more flavor. So that's where I'm going to start. I'm going to start with some fresh tomatoes that I have. These are just regular globe tomatoes. You can use any kind of tomato, cherry, plum, whatever you have on hand. I have lightly coated these in oil, and I'm just going to season them very lightly with a little bit of salt, and then I'm going to roast them. I love roasting tomatoes because it brings out this flavor called umami that tomatoes have in them. Umami is a savory, meaty, delicious flavor. It's that flavor that makes you want to go back for another bite of food. So by roasting these tomatoes, we're going to get a lot of that umami out of them, and they're going to start to brown and bubble and caramelize, and that's going to bring out the natural sweetness of tomatoes as well. So I've just tossed these in a little oil, a little salt on them, and I'm going to put them in my oven at 425 degrees. So those are going to go in there for about 20 minutes. While these are roasting, we can start with our soup. So I like to have a big pot when I'm making soup, just so I have enough room. And I'm going to turn my pot onto about a medium-high heat. I always like to heat up my pot before I add anything to it. And to this pot, we're going to add 3 tablespoons of oil. If I'm using any kind of high heat, I like to use canola oil because it's less likely to burn. So I'm going to let that oil heat up for about 30 seconds to a minute, and then I'm going to add my onions. I'm going to saute these onions until they're soft and translucent and starting to turn brown. Just like how we want our tomatoes to turn brown, we want our onions to turn brown as well. That's just going to add a lot more flavor to our soup. So that oil should be nice and hot at this point. I'm going to add my onions. I'm going to make this a little bit hotter. And we're just going to saute this again until they're soft and starting to brown. Now I did say that this is a soup that we can make mostly from the pantry. We are using onions and garlic in here. Onions and garlic are some fresh produce that do last a really long time, even at room temperature. So it's something that I always encourage people to have on hand because those onions are going to last a couple weeks. So if you find that you can't go to the grocery store very often, we do know that if we can buy a lot of onions, we can use them in our food, and they're just going to add a lot of extra flavor to what we're doing. If you don't have onions, that's okay. We can use things like onion and garlic powder to get a little bit of that flavor in our soup. So I can hear the onions sizzling. That's a really good sign. We always want to hear that sizzle when we're cooking our onions. Alright, so our onions have been cooking for about 8 minutes at this point. We can see that they are starting to turn translucent. They look really nice and soft, and some of those pieces of onion have begun to start browning. So this is ready for me to add my garlic. I have about 4 cloves of garlic here because I like to use a lot. If you don't have fresh garlic, I would use about a teaspoon of garlic powder. And I'm just going to cook this garlic for about 30 seconds. That's really all it needs to start to become very fragrant. You can start to really smell that garlic. And again, I don't want to burn the garlic because it will start to turn bitter. So if that garlic is turning brown, then we're going to have that bitter flavor in our soup. So we want to avoid that. So I can really smell that garlic now. And now what I'm going to do is add 3 tablespoons of flour to my pot. So I had 3 tablespoons of oil. Now I'm adding 3 tablespoons of flour. And what this flour is going to do is help to thicken our soup. We're not adding any butter or any cream to this soup, so we want that flour cooking in that oil, which is going to allow that soup to thicken up really nicely. So we can see that this is starting to form almost a paste in our pot. And we just want to let that flour cook for about 30 seconds to a minute in that oil. If we add liquid to this right away, our soup is just going to taste like raw flour and it's not really going to thicken. So we need to let that flour cook before it will start to thicken any liquids. Some people like to cook their flour until it starts to smell nutty. You don't have to take it that far. You really only need about a minute. Alright, so this is about good now, which means that we can start to add our liquids. So I'm going to start by adding some chicken stock. This is homemade. I had it in the freezer for a few months and I just thawed it earlier today. I have about 4 cups of stock here. I'm going to add that. I'm going to add this slowly because I don't want that flour to get really clumpy. And I don't feel like getting a whisk dirty, so I just like to add this slowly to dissolve all of that flour and avoid clumps. Now if you don't have homemade stock, you can use store-bought stock either in a carton or the powdered stock concentrate. You do want to be careful because a lot of store-bought stocks have a lot of salt added to them. Usually when we make it at home, we don't add any salt. So if you're using a store-bought stock and it does not say that it's unsalted, then make sure you taste your soup before adding any extra salt to it. So I've added my stock. I don't see any clumps in here, which means I can go ahead and add my tomatoes. I'm just using whole peeled tomatoes and I'm making sure to get all of that great juice that's in there as well. If you don't have whole peeled tomatoes, you can use diced tomatoes if that's what you have on hand. You could even use a can of tomato sauce if that's all you have. So we're going to let this simmer for about 20 minutes. If you want to, you can add extra seasonings to your soup. I have on hand some basil, some Italian seasoning, parsley flakes, and some crushed red pepper because I like really spicy soup. Again, it's whatever you have on hand, whatever flavors you like. And I'm really just adding a couple shakes of each seasoning. It's going to be less than a 1/4 teaspoon of each seasoning, more like 1/8 of a teaspoon. A little bit of parsley, and then with crushed red pepper you do want to be really careful. When we cook it in things like sauces and soups, it does become a lot spicier than it would taste if we're just sprinkling it on top of some food. So you do want to be careful not to add too much because I have accidentally made things way too spicy before by going too crazy on the crushed red pepper. Then I'm going to add some black pepper to this. And because my stock is unsalted and my canned tomatoes were unsalted, I'm going to add about 1/2 teaspoon of salt to begin with. I'll taste this after it simmers for a little while and see if I need to add any more salt. In about 20 minutes, those tomatoes that I have in the oven will be finished. I'll add them to my soup, simmer for another 40 minutes, puree it, and then it'll be done. So we'll check back in about 20 minutes to go ahead and add those roasted tomatoes. Alright, so our soup has been simmering for about 20 minutes, which means that our tomatoes have been roasting for just about as long as well. So I'm going to go ahead and check on my tomatoes. We can hear them sizzling in the oven, which is always a good sign. Alright. So we can see with these tomatoes, that the skin has started to blister and pop open. It's started to turn nice and brown, so that's all a good sign. So I'm going to go ahead and add these tomatoes to my soup. Because these are globe tomatoes and a little bit on the bigger side, I'm just going to kind of cut them open a little bit, just with a paring knife so that they don't splash a bunch when they go into my soup. This is also a good opportunity to make sure that no explosions happen because the inside of the tomato is really hot. I want to make sure that they don't pop and get all over the place. So these are nice and tender because they have been roasting. So I'm just going to cut these open, release all of those juices, which are then going to go right into the soup. Alright, so I've cut those open. I'm going to go ahead and add that to the soup. If you wanted to roast these even longer, you could, but I think these are great. That's a lot of great flavor that we're going to get there from that liquid. Alright, so we've added our tomatoes. I'm going to go ahead and try to crush some of these tomatoes that came from the can just so that they can release their juices as well, and just help to season that soup a little bit more. And then I'm gonna taste the soup. So it's been simmering for about 20 minutes. It's gonna need about 20 minutes more. So we're halfway through, meaning that this is a really good time to taste your soup and make sure it tastes good. We don't want to just add a bunch of salt at the end of cooking, because then all we're going to taste is salt. So we want to make sure we're adding salt while we're cooking, because that's going to help to bring out more flavors in the soup. So remember, I added about half a teaspoon before I got started. There was some salt on top of those tomatoes that I roasted. So we do already have some salt in here. So I'm just going to taste a little bit. So I can taste all the seasonings that I added to it. It's already got a little bit of kick from the crushed red pepper. I don't think I need to add any salt to this. I'm getting a lot of really great flavors right now, so I'm not going to add any salt right now. Maybe that'll change after I puree the soup. We'll see what happens. After I puree the soup, I'm going to make sure to taste it again, make sure it tastes good before I say that it's finished. So we're going to simmer this for another 20 minutes, just let all of those flavors really come out. We'll puree, taste again, and then we'll be done. Alright, so our soup's been simmering for 20 minutes, which means that in total it's been simmering for 40 minutes. You want to let soup simmer for that amount of time because it really helps to bring just all of the flavors out. So what I'm going to do now is puree the soup. You can use a blender for this. I have an immersion blender, so I like to use this because then I don't have to use a ladle transferred to a blender. These are just a lot easier. If you are going to use a blender to blend your soup, make sure you do it in small batches. You don't want to fill your blender up more than halfway because that can get really dangerous. We don't want to have hot soup all over the place. But I'm going to use this and just puree that soup. And that's all we need to do to make a nice creamy tomato soup. But we're not done yet. We want to make sure that we're always tasting as we go. So I'm going to taste this one more time, make sure it still tastes good. Now if you wanted this thicker, you could let this simmer longer, so it would reduce down and get a little thicker. I like the consistency that it is, so I'm probably going to eat this right away. And to me that tastes perfect. I really like being able to mix canned tomatoes with those fresh roasted tomatoes together because it does add a lot of flavor to our soup. But again, if you only have canned tomatoes on hand, that's okay. If you only have fresh tomatoes on hand, that's also okay. So the great thing about this soup is if we want to, we can freeze some of it, maybe about half of it, and have it for later on. This is really tasty to me, so I'm probably going to eat it all before it goes bad, so I probably won't even stick any in the freezer. But it is nice to just have some soup on hand. It makes for really easy lunches and dinners. We could serve this with some grilled cheese if we want to. Have some great whole grain bread that's going to go really well with this. And that's it. Again, my name is Emily. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me or leave some in the comments. I love hearing from you all, and I'll see you next time.